As a marketer, you must tell the audience, I know my product. If the student is ready, the teacher will show up.
Jagdish Sheth is a professor of marketing at the Gazeta Business School of Emory University in the USA. He is internationally known for his scholarly contribution in consumer behavior and marketing. Professor Sheth has published more than 400 research papers and 40 books. He has provided consulting for numerous companies in the US, Europe and Asia such as AT&T, Ford, General Electric, Nortel, Whirlpool and others. He was a prominent member of the core team during the initial years of the Indian Institute of Management Calcutta, the first IIM. He was awarded Padma Bhushan by Government of India in 2020 for his work in literature and education in the US.
So namaste Jagdish ji. And it's
Namaste.
really a pleasure to talk to you. Is it okay if we begin from your middle school, high school days? And I understand
Sure.
that you spent them in what was then called Madras and now called Chennai. So do you
Yes,
remember any school teachers or anything, how they influenced you, any particular ones that you can talk about?
I do not remember the names, but in Chennai, probably the most influential teacher in the high school was my chemistry teacher. Somehow he liked me, I liked him, and he began to encourage me to think about more chemistry, play with the chemistry, etc. So I was more toward chemical engineering, let's say if I had gone into engineering, as opposed to mechanical or, something that based on physics. I think that was clearly one thing. That's my only memory right now. It's so many years ago.
That's understandable. And you actually turned to psychology. Would that be correct to say?
Yes.
How did you see in India in school? Most of the curriculum they don't study psychology as a subject. So maybe what is it that fascinated you about psychology? If you can tell us.
I think it's an excellent question, and it ties into my own internal passion. I always was curious about what motivates people. And the curiosity became more real, practical, when I started working in my brother's company, which is a manufacturing jewelry boxes. And he asked me to do everything. So during summer breaks, I'll spend 2-3 months there managing customers, managing factory workers, employees. And I began to really figure out two things. One is that people have different motivations, different perceptions, and relationships matter a lot. And I learned that quite early in my high school days in Chennai. And so when I went for further studies, even though I went to America to do my MBA for manufacturing or production management, what really excited me was the psychology. And in fact, the most influential psychologist for me was Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And I said, this is what I want to study. So I went for my doctorate in behavioral sciences.
That's really nice and that's fascinating. You begin your book by a story where you raised your hand and asked a question in the class, and that question played a big role, a pivotal role in your journey as a scholar. So, can you briefly tell us what was that question and how did that really play such an important role?
In the class on marketing management, very eminent professor was talking about the latest data about household or housewives consumption and shopping behavior. And he said that now majority of the shoppers or homemakers go to the grocery store without a shopping list, and therefore they are impulse buyers. Now the first part is factual, second part is inferential. You will draw an conclusions. And I'm from India. I was the only foreign student in the classroom. I'm short. I always, sat in the front, very studious. Just like in India, we worship teachers and professors like they're next to God and above parents clearly. But something urged me, and I raised my hand and I said, Dr. Howard was his name. Does this mean that all illiterate societies are impulse buyers? He was astounded. He was stunned. And of course, in America, you have the debate issue. The students and the professor should, debate with each other, discuss, etc., as opposed to take notes. But the class is waiting for a counter response, etc. And he knew that there was no answer here properly. So he said, it's a good question. Let's talk about it later on. That led me to one very fundamental issue in scholarship, that the data is one thing, inference is different thing. And more powerful is logic, not what we call logical positivism, which means empirical studies. I can easily look upon the data in a different perspective and come out with different interpretations, as we do with the demographic data, economic data, any data primarily. And as we become more and more data-driven society, data is the new oil, as they call it, I worry quite a lot that unless one has a good inferential proposition, something that anchors you properly, you can make wrong inferences from the same data. And that was really remarkable. Now, more remarkable than that is the professor. John Howard was a great mentor in my life. In fact, who I am, most of it owes to him, especially in America. I needed some extra money to invite my fiance to marry me. And I was looking for money, even though my heart was in management and leadership primarily. He had the research money. And I went there with a lot of anxiety because, that incident, I didn't feel good about it myself. And it turned out, he says, yes, I do remember you in my class. And yes, I would like to have you work for me for extra money because you gave a perspective that I never had. I grew up in a literate society. We don't even think about illiteracy. You have a cultural experiences which are different than mine. And therefore, he basically adopted me as his assistant. And the rest is the history, essentially.
Yeah, that is such a wonderful story. And Jagdish ji, many of the listeners here may be students, and some of them may have questions, but some of them may also be shy about asking questions. Do you have any tips for them as to how do you ask good questions?
I personally think, based on my own experiences, at a very young age, if possible, you should be able to go into the public stage and be comfortable to talk. So first thing is that you can counterbalance shyness by having a speaking confidence. Ultimately, what matters is self-confidence. So it doesn't get into shyness, into anxiety, and doesn't matter who you deal with, whether you are dealing with a president of a nation or a prime minister or a teacher or a professor, doesn't matter, I think, so long as you have a self-confidence. And it comes through learning, it comes through knowledge, it comes through reading. You are a knowledgeable person and always thinking that I can ask insightful questions, not to put down the speaker or criticize, but to learn more from. So the best thing I've learned over time is that learning is most important asset you will ever have, or aptitude. And there's a very nice saying in the Eastern culture, if the student is ready, the teacher will show up. So you can learn from anybody if you are happy or if you're eager to learn, and you can learn from your peers, not your superiors. And you can learn from trees, you can learn from mountains, you can learn from nature. And I think that attitude that I'm here to learn, and there's no upper limit of learning, I think you will always feel strong about yourself. You're curious, you're motivated, etc. That's the only advice I can give you.
Just to go back to Professor John Howard, you had such a wonderful mentor and a collaborator as well, right? For such a long time. What did you learn from Professor Howard?
I learned three things which were unusual. First of all, despite his eminence, he was very approachable. He did not think I'm superior and you're inferior, and on all the meetings. So he knew how to say welcome. It was just in his eyes, in his body language. And he was quite for an economist, he was quite interested in marketing side or the consumption side, and he knew how to relate to the industry. So one was his aptitude about reaching out to people. That I learned quite a lot how to do it and why it's important. Second one is that he just was obsessed about learning. Doesn't matter, day and night. I mean, he worked very hard, but more from the viewpoint is that I have a limited time, I can learn so much. Let me learn more and more. And I think that obsession grew on me. I'm sure it was there, but it grew even more, legitimized it by and large, right? And a third thing, something that I really did not appreciate coming from our culture, where we never keep the paper, which is like a, Lakshmi, I mean, the Saraswati, I mean, goddess Saraswati, knowledge goddess, you never put the paper down on the floor. But he had a habit of putting all his writings and papers on the floor, something important on the floor. And I used to always say, this is not a good thing to do. I never had the courage to tell him, look, in my culture, this is considered bad manners. But it grew on me. So today I do the same thing. Best things I write, I still write by hand. I put them down on the floor. Fortunately, it's on a carpet floor, not a dirty floor. But still, that's a third thing I learned, which I wish I had not learned.
And how does it help, by the way? So having all these questions and what you're curious about around you in the room, does that help you?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
I definitely. And I enjoy students who are curious.
Okay.
There's a clear demarcation between students who are curious, who want to know. And I do believe that ultimately we all have to be, as we more specialize in education, become a surgeon, for example, or ENT surgeon even more, or an orthopedic surgeon. More you specialize, the more you must become a generalist.
Yeah.
I call it a deep generalist.
Okay.
So we should have the width of knowledge,
Yeah.
and an expertise specialization in something. The reason I find is that if you're more eclectic in your general knowledge, then you begin to see things which are not connected, and connecting the dot is probably the best creativity.
Wonderful. And one of the things which struck me as I was reading your autobiography was the breadth of collaborations you had. I mean, so many people from different fields you met, and not just, I mean, meeting is one thing, but creatively collaborating and writing papers. How did you manage to do that? And that could be relevant for students as well, perhaps.
What happens in collaboration is a mutual learning. And often you end up not only your own doctoral student, which is where you start collaborating, but a young colleague who somehow likes your work, has read your work, and says, I'm very passionate about doing more work on what you do. I would love to have you as my co-author, collaborator, researcher. And your role becomes one of guiding the person, but more importantly, learning from the person. And that's the reason, because of the obsession to learn, everybody has a perspective that may be as valuable as your perspective, kind of a notion. And that has been the joy of working together with other people. I do believe there is a fundamental, I was trying to analyze myself as to why I end up collaborating and become productive in the process. And that's because I always have felt that I am more like an architect. I know how to design the research, how to design the paper, how to write the paper, but I need a builder. So many of my collaborators love to be builders, and I'm the architect, and you have to work together, architect and the builder work together, ultimately to have a beautiful level of a building or artifact, whatever you have. And that seems to work very well with me.
That's a very good point. You're saying for collaboration to really work, perhaps there are roles which are complementary to each other that one needs to find, and that helps a lot.
Yeah, and I do believe one more thing in collaboration is commitment to the punctuality, the time, the deadlines. No matter how busy you are, once you make that commitment, you should find the time, and or renegotiate that you have a time issue by and large. Usually I'm good, although with so many commitments, with so many people, besides also charity work and community work and teaching and all that. So I'm having a more difficult time keeping up my part of the bargain. And my younger colleagues have a clock ticking for the promotion tenure. And I feel bad about it, but try very hard to work on Saturdays, Sundays, evenings, somehow to get it's a mission driven approach to doing things.
So that's amazing how you bring so much of energy to this mission. Really wonderful. Now, many of the listeners may be aspiring innovators here. They are students, but they may have role models. In schools, they may be doing maybe projects. They may be builders right now, but also eventually they would have to present their projects. They have to communicate their idea, market it.
Yes.
And you are marketing
Yes.
guru. What kind of tips can you offer? Some tips for them for whom building may be more natural than presentation could be daunting.
Yeah, and generally, I would agree that marketing is harder than we think. Innovation is easier than we think. And therefore, we underestimate the importance of marketing in innovation. The tips are very simple. First tip is to have the self-confidence. As a marketer, you must tell the audience, your prospective customers, your partners, I know my product. The more you have knowledge of your product, not in terms of how you designed it, which is what inventors, innovators do, but how it is used by the consumer. So having that user perspective is very, very important. And so therefore you can downstream mentally and say, after the product is bought, how will the consumer use the product? And in the usage, what are the friction points? If you think through properly, your own self-confidence goes up in the process. You have put yourself in the shoes of the consumer, both as a shopper or a buyer, but also as a user. And that seems to be the first thing lesson in marketing that you learn. Second thing is that it's all about increasing awareness. You know who you are, you know your product, but the rest of the world does not know. And generally, you tend to be shy to say, why should I promote my product? But one has to do that thing. So one has to have increased its awareness, which can be done nowadays through social media. In fact, if you take the TikTok, for example, which is a interesting young people's platform, or if you take a YouTube, how many people have done something crazy, innovative, either product design or some dance or whatever it is. Once they put it there, they got the confidence to say, I would like to post it. And it simply is a viral marketing, it just goes on. I'm amazed. And they become influencers in the process quite often. So I think awareness increase is very important. Second area is very key that quite often a consumer is ready, but he's hesitant. So how do you make into a prospect into a customer, as we call it? So people have a predisposition, but what inducements can you offer? What can you do to encourage them to buy? I think that's the second thing, action essentially. And the third stage, which is more recent thinking in marketing, is that it is not one-time transaction, but a repeat transaction is very important. Not only in grocery products, the daily consumption, the milk, the bread, the cereals, but also equally important in motorcycles, equally important in automobiles, appliances, cell phones, doesn't matter. So you have to think about whatever I do, will the customer come back again to buy from me? And now we have basically put into a mathematical formula to calculate what we call the lifetime value of a customer. A transaction may be a very small amount, but over lifetime, the same consumer spends so much more. So suddenly you begin to have an enormous respect for that customer. You are a very good innovator, but he's a very good customer. So you begin to say we have a mutual interest in creating an exchange. And therefore, I think so we call it as a relationship aspect. Post-purchase things you must do right.
Wow, that's amazing. Short crash course on marketing that you gave. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You talk about these 3 I's of learning in digital era.
Yeah.
What are these 3 I's, and why do you think they're so important?
If you take the way we got our education and learning, and if you go back to the pre-literacy days when everything was through oral communication, and from world, academies. I found that at that time, we all learned as good citizens from three sources. I call it the three C's of learning. You learned your craft under a master guild, somebody who had perfected how to make a best, a gold product or a silver product or a iron, something, whatever they did. So ironsmith, goldsmith, etc., or sculpture, painting, whatever turns out to be. So that's one is craft. Second one is very important. Community taught a lot of lessons, as they do in rural India even now. Community is a network where you learn quite a lot what is right behavior, what is not a right behavior, because it's a social governance mechanism as opposed to a legal governance. And the third thing is congregation, which in those days would be pre-formal religions, but eventually religion became the platform for congregation. So whatever religion you belong to, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Jewish, doesn't make any difference, but it is a religion that brings you together. Socially, you learn what are the norms, rituals you learn. Those three C's of learning was the platform in the agricultural economy. Then when we became industrial revolution came, we wanted literacy, how to read and write, which is only in the 20th century phenomenon actually. And so people began to go into what is called the 3 R's of learning: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And our curriculum as of today also is strictly 3 R's of learning. And as we go more and more on the digital learning, online learning, the same 3 R's of learning, the curriculum does not match very well. So in the digital world, I've come out with the 3 I's of learning. In the digital world, unless you make the learning interactive, our conversation is interactive. If I just spoke, it will not be as exciting as you asking me questions, my answering, real time. So its interactivity is very key in online learning. How do you engage the learner with the learned, essentially? Second thing is that the learning should be more integrative. That means there's something common between math and music. The left brain, right brain argument now is set aside because math is a language, music is a language. And by the way, software is a language. So how do you rise above the language per se, the syntax, the semantics, into meta-analysis to say there's something common there that we can think about and integrate that knowledge? It leaves you into a different platform. So learning has to be integrative. What you study in one subject, there's a connection or a relevance or a correlation with some other subject. And the last one and the most important is that in the online technology, learning must be individualized. And fortunately, the technology enables to do what I call mass customization or mass personalization. So a student who is behind slightly, student who is very ahead slightly, a student seems to finish things in time, students have some delay, I can accommodate all that in the online platform. So learning has to be individualized, interactive, and integrated.
No, this is very beautiful and quite relevant. And if you take Indian context today, which of these I's you think is most challenging for us?
I think probably the most important one to shift the paradigm from the industrial age learning to the digital age learning would be interaction. And in India, generally, we have made the student take notes. I used to write copious notes. That was the main thing. Or when I read a textbook, I would underline everything that I wanted to remember. And before the final exams or the state exams, you spend 1 month memorizing all that, right? Now, memory is not a bad idea. I believe in that system, but I think it can be enhanced even more by having interaction. And especially interaction that requires not just the brain, the mind, but also the hands, as in engineering, chemistry, health sciences, medical field. You have to touch, feel, sensory. So all 5 senses come together, which in a cognitive learning, mental learning, only 1 or 2 senses come. Hearing and visual primarily. So more you can engage all your 5 senses in learning, the learning remains more permanent pretty much.
Right.
Like cooking, chefs learn how to cut things properly, etc. It takes time.
Yep.
But that's so interaction is the key one, in my view, in India.
Yeah, and perhaps that ties in well with what Agastya is trying to do, hands-on,
Yes.
models and hands-on experimentation. But do you think it also can extend to languages?
I think it can extend. It will be a little non-intuitive in many ways.
Yeah.
But one of the ways to extend the language would be to actually not only speak the language, but begin to write the language as you speak. So you see the syntax of the language as you speak can be written. That adds one additional dimension, which is physical touch, feel.
Sure.
The other one is the best way to learn is to teach.
Yeah.
So if I'm a language professor or a teacher, I need to teach because every time I teach, I'm learning a lot. It's this iterative process. It's like upgrade of the software, from one experiment to the other experiment. So to me, best way to learn language is to start teaching the language to other people.
Right. And you're saying perhaps even students can teach their friends.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is why it's important to create peer groups, learn from each other, or take any opportunity. So if you're a high school student, can I teach primary school kids, for example? And the more you have higher level knowledge, and the more you try to teach to the lower level, let's say, primary school, secondary school, tertiary, and etc., the more you will learn how to communicate simply.
Now, as an expert on consumer behavior, I also see you as a futurist, which means you are able to see how the trends are going, in the next maybe 5, 10, 20 years. Can you give us a glimpse of what is coming ahead?
Probably I can synthesize by saying maybe 3 different things that we need to watch about how the human life itself will be shaped enormously. And in general, our whole day-to-day living, our occupation, everything will be impacted. One is clearly the further evolution and revolution of the digital technology. Just if we think that the cell phones, the network, the internet has done enormous change, which it has, I think going forward, the changes will be more rapid and probably more amplified. We are all watching 2 or 3 newer technologies as they're becoming more mature over time, artificial intelligence, and how that will impact the human life. And that changes the society in a way that we have never imagined. Actually, I am writing my next book in that area, that one of the side effects of the internet age is that the virtual becomes real, artificial becomes real, and people are bonding more with digital avatars or digital personalities more so than human personalities. That's fascinating. Now, if you are in that world of science fiction, essentially, which is real in the mind, what happens to the real world? One can think about all the implications in the process, right? So to me, artificial intelligence, blockchain is another very important technology. Those are the 2 that I think we have to watch and see how they will impact the society at large. Everything we do, from studying, for example, to working, for example, to any institution that we deal with primarily. Second major change is demographic. And this is happening even in countries like India, although in advanced countries it's very prevalent. We are all becoming more and more roommate families. Even in a family, we don't have the time to spend with each other. So today, especially in metro areas in India, everybody rushes to have quick dinner. Then after quick dinner, everybody goes in their own corner or separate rooms if you are having enough in the flat. Somebody is doing text messaging, somebody is watching YouTube, somebody is watching on the phone talking, somebody is watching television. And I've taken photos of those where my grandchildren sitting next to each other don't talk, but they text message each other. And I said, this is interesting. So we are becoming more a roommate nations, roommate family, which says that the bonding that we have from one generation to the other generation, which in the older days, there was a social contract between the child and the parent from the time the child was born. Parents nurture you, take care of you, but you have an obligation that you will take care of parents. I see that going away. We all love our parents, but it cannot be done anymore because we are so preoccupied with so many things. So demographics is the other area that I watch and begin to extrapolate into the future, especially its implication. So for example, when a nation is aging, then what happens? When a nation is aging, as in America, we are aging, we are now having 10,000 people every day becoming retirees for the next 2 decades. Does it not, or not only does it have a shortage of labor, hands-on active labor, but more importantly, when I grow older, my needs change fundamentally. I'm more concerned about health preservation and wealth preservation. So those industries will take more share of the GDP than many other industries at one time. I think it's a question of downstreaming further, mentally exercising and say, based upon context, the reality, what is likely to be the consequence of that major shift in the society, which is demographics.
So that makes me curious. How does Jagdish ji manage, not to retire at all? What's the secret?
I think the secret is primarily obsession to learn, but more importantly, giving back to the society. There's nothing more satisfying inner than to say, I enable somebody else, I help somebody else. Financially is fine, but I unlocked that person's potential that he or she did not realize. And I think if we have that attitude to say we are here, the purpose of a nation even, I think, is to unlock the potential of its people, which is where I think Agastya is just the right platform. You take this curious mind of very young people who are constantly wanting to learn, you give them the context, the experiments, something to play around with no judgment. Because students worry about judgment. How is my teacher thinking about it? How is my parent thinking? With no judgment. So what happens is that all of a sudden they get engaged and lots of creativity comes in the process. And I think it's a great, great platform what you do. So given that, to me, that is the ultimate sign of giving back to the society. At my age, I've done a lot of advising, consulting to lots of entrepreneurs who are billionaires, senior chairmen of the large companies. And I concluded over time that if you make money without meaning, it's meaningless. It makes you empty inside. And if you don't share that wealth you created, then the society isolates you. You are a taker, not a giver. And they say, why should we recognize you even? Why should we embrace you as a good human being? Surprisingly, there's this silent boycott that takes place for people who are unable to share their wealth. Wealth could be physical, monetary wealth, could be knowledge wealth, whatever it is, it turns out to be. So surprisingly, the more you give back, the more you get. And the drive to give back, the drive to learn constantly keeps you young.
That's really great. And you sort of epitomize this. It's one thing to just talk about it and say, but it's another thing to actually live it. So it's really wonderful to see that.
Thank you.
Towards the end of the book, you also say this: life is as much about the journey as the destination. Now, some of the listeners, maybe let's take a 7th grader, typical listener here. In a few years, he would be entering the world of competitive exams. And maybe destinations like good colleges would be really important. How would you explain this to him?
The exams and going to a top university or a college, an IIT, comparable to BITS Pilani or whatever they are, I think it's more the dream of the parent, not the student. Parents have a knack of putting that pressure on the students. I think today we have to allow the student to say, I will try my best, I will achieve whatever I can and be happy with it. I think disappointment of aspiring too high and not achieving is self-defeating. All of us cannot be at the top rank. It should be okay to be something less than that, so long it is something that you enjoy and you have an inner happiness, whatever you do. In fact, there is a conclusive evidence that the best entrepreneurs really don't like schooling at all. Because schools or universities, colleges, we put rules and regulations. We put constraints. No, you cannot do this thing. No, classes are at this time. These are these break times. And entrepreneurs are free. They just want no constraints, which is why some of the best entrepreneurs are college dropouts. I find fascinating some of the best entrepreneurs are not necessarily business entrepreneurs, but social entrepreneurs. And the most obvious entrepreneurs I find are the band leaders, music, rock band leaders. Beatles were great entrepreneurs. It's just mind-boggling to see how, because they're obsessed about what they like to do even during middle school days. And that could be an engineer, a scientist, whatever it is. I think we need to allow more to say, ultimately, now you may go into an IIT, let's say, but if you don't enjoy, it's okay to shift to something else. Which is why I also say that the national education policy of 2020, world-class people brainstorm and allows that flexibility to the student to say, you can start here, but you don't have to end there. You have the credit banks, you can have courses, so many credit, you can go around, which is more a personalization of education in a large mass market like India. So I do believe that in many ways, that freedom is important to the person in selecting what they want to do. Now, I'm not opposed to what we have done, because I tell you, India has generated such a great talent. And I'm so grateful to the nation because I got everything free education. There's no way except to have a sense of gratitude. And that is why Agastya types of organizations are very important in India, because it gives that free education, free experimentation, no matter who you want to be eventually.
That's really great. Yeah. And so what you're saying is it's as much relevant or perhaps more relevant to parents and maybe teachers than to students who may be putting their anxieties and their aspirations onto students, is what you're saying.
Right.
That makes sense. So do you have any message for the young listeners, especially the school children?
I think there are 2 or 3 quick lessons as youngsters you grow up. Make sure you have fun as much as learning. Learning with fun, learning with positive attitude toward learning. It's not a chore, it's an enjoyment is very key, I think. Second thing is, at that age, you are learning with other kids, other children. How do you manage to work with other children and create a sort of a social interaction? Learning about social interaction with other children, hopefully they're with their parents, and when they have a parent-to-parent get-together, you are in a social ecosystem. You cannot be isolated from that, and you need to learn as a youngster how to be with other people. You cannot isolate. That's the second thought. Third thing is, and one thing that can be very important, and I began to advocate more strongly in my later life, actually, just self-confidence. There's nothing called wrong. Everything is right. Wrong behavior we understand in terms of mischief and all that stuff. But learning-wise, everything is right. And you have that attitude which builds your self-confidence. And self-confidence goes a long way. Not only creates a self-esteem for yourself, which is why young people struggle quite often, because they don't seem to have a self-esteem about themselves. So you have to have the self-esteem building that you do, character in some fashion, and then, of course, interaction with other people. I think those are in addition to learning with fun.
Beautiful. But just to pursue that self-confidence a little bit, because sometimes you perhaps don't get good marks, and immediately somebody, either teacher or parents, are going to point it out, and that's perhaps going to put a dent on your confidence level. And in India, failure is looked upon, very strongly as something negative. Is there, do you have any suggestions or tips as to how do you manage? Everybody in life is going to have one share of what are the so-called failures.
At the school age, it's a little harder because you are wanting to have the admiration and respect of your teachers toward you, your parents toward you, your older siblings toward you. So you're trying to show I'm a good kid. Exam is just one indicator. And that's the key problem, in my view, in some sense, because you take too seriously upon yourself in the process. But as we have said, and as you've grown up, especially, failure is a good lesson to learn. We always say without failure, you cannot succeed. And I think having that view also is equally important at a younger age. That doesn't mean you slacken off. That doesn't mean you play sports all the time, or music or something and pay no attention to the class and the studies, or you're basically creating mischief in the class. Typically all youngsters do. So I think main thing around here is that failure can be managed not as much by the student, but by their mentors. If the teacher says, I know you failed, I know you can do better than what you have done. Let me show you how to do it better next time. If the parents say, I understand you failed and I know why you failed because you did not put your time, you are smarter than the indicator of failure or exam or whatever it is, you really need to do the following to do better. I think that message is a message of accepting the failure by the people that the youngster admires, wants the respect from them is very key. You have to disassociate failure from respect and admiration.
Yeah. So I think that's a very important point. You're saying the people around you, the system has an important role to play here in building self-confidence among the students.
And I will do the reverse, which is interesting. When I grew up as a youngster, I still remember, fortunately, I was a good student and I would get my scorecard every week. This was when I was in Borivali near Bombay. Excellent education I got, middle school essentially. And my older sisters were very nurturing. They would actually sit with me and praise me and say, you did such a great job, but remember, you cannot do harm to other people. You cannot do mischief. They were putting ethics in my mind while praising me. I still remember those. And almost it's a weekly encounter. So I would rush from the school, take my grade card with me. It was some sort of a grade card that we had in a booklet like thing, and show all the grades by the teachers. And they would have the time to spend. My biggest worry today is that, except for maybe in the rural India, parents have no time to spend, to review, to basically, you need that kind of an informal mentoring, not just a casual conversation. And I tell you, that made the difference in my life.
No, I think that's a very good story, and how your sisters, you're saying it's not just about just praising, but I think that conversation and the responsibility towards people around you.
Exactly.
That's very important. Okay, finally, do you have any message for Agastya?
The only message for Agastya is to do more and more. It's just a great platform. When I learned about Agastya, I really got immediately passionate, because I do believe that you need to have things of hands and things of mind come together. And taking the laboratory experiments out in the field, more like a fun, whatever we do, I think it's just so resonating. It's so intuitive. It's so obvious and still not done. And therefore, this journey of Agastya, I think, is very valuable, not just in India, but India is a experiment, a role model. As you expand to Bangladesh, for example, or eventually to Africa, for example, I mean, its mission is to unlock the potential of people. And the more we unlock the potential of people, the more affluence will come, prosperity will come, less tensions will arise. It's not like a either or, but it's and kind of a thinking. I think it's such a fantastic platform.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful and a great privilege to talk to you, Jagdishji. really appreciate your time and sharing your wisdom. Really, really nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.